Hey guys, Tony with AmericanBelts.com. Today the question on the table is what makes a good gun belt, or what makes a good everyday carry belt? So we're going to take a look at that. There's a couple of key factors. Let's dive into it. The biggest key and the biggest factor for a good gun belt is support. Now, support for your gun belt can come from a couple different places. First of all, the width of the belt itself. All of our gun belts are at least 1.5 inches wide. Your typical dress belt that you would buy at a department store is going to usually be 1.25 inches wide. You wouldn't think that 1/4 inch makes that much of a difference, but believe me, it does. All of our Titan and Boss series belts are 1.5 inches wide. So outside of the width of the belt, the most important part that's going to give that belt support that it needs is the leather itself. Now there are a couple different kinds of leather and they're sort of made from different parts of the hide, and we'll take a look at that. But traditionally you either have solid, full grain, hard leather, or sometimes people will use a stiffener like a steel core or a polymer core, some sort of insert in thinner leather layers to give it the support that the leather itself is not providing. Now there's nothing wrong with a steel core belt or a polymer insert belt necessarily, but the reality is most people aren't going to need the level of support that a steel core belt is going to give you unless you're carrying extremely heavy guns, multiple guns, but your normal average everyday carrier is not going to need that. A secondary problem that can happen with steel core belts is sometimes it can be too stiff. You want the leather to be stiff enough to support the weight, but you also want it to contour to your body. Sometimes with certain steel core belts, if that insert is too rigid, it can actually pull the belt away from your natural curves and pull the gun away from your body, making concealment more difficult. So the support from our Titan and Boss series belts comes from the leather itself. So why is our leather better and stronger? I'll tell you. If you look at a diagram of a steer hide, you will see that it's comprised of several different layers. The very lower end is going to be the flesh side that's typically removed during processing. From the top of the leather to about 1/4 inch down is considered full grain leather. Now this layer of leather is typically the stiffest, the least prone to stretching because it has that outer skin layer attached to it, and it's a little more rugged looking. So just below the surface of the full grain leather, you start what's called top grain leather. Now top grain leather, even though it's not including the actual top of the hide itself, can be relatively durable. But typically what happens is they'll sand or split a very thin layer off the very top, removing that full grain. Now once they do that and clear that off, then you end up with a very smooth, consistent top surface. Now that can be very useful if you want to do things like emboss it or add a texture to it to make it very uniform and consistent. But that uniformity does come at a cost. Top grain leather is typically a little less durable than full grain leather because it's missing that very top layer of the hide. Also, because that top layer is missing, it's a little more prone to stretching over time. So just below the top grain, the next layers down are usually made for splits or suede. This is also known as genuine leather. So just be aware, whenever you see genuine leather on a belt, put that belt down and go to AmericanBelts.com and buy a real belt. Genuine leather typically consists of those layers of split leathers and scrap material that's ground up, mixed with adhesives and oils and colors and dyes, and then extruded into a sheet. Now that type of leather is typically used for upholstery or things like handbags or clothing. And while it can look very nice, it's just not durable long term and should never be used for making belts. So here guys is an example quickly of a genuine leather belt. You can see it's relatively narrow, it's very smooth on the top, but this belt is so flexible. This belt is going to give you nearly no rigidity or support. And this would be your typical like reversible buckle belt that you would buy at a department store. If you're carrying a gun, do not use one of these belts. Now our belts, by contrast, you can see the full grain of that leather. It's very stiff. It doesn't fold in on itself at all. You can't crease this leather like you can the other one. And I mean, this sucker is rigid. It's going to do the job. It's going to hold whatever you want to attach to this. So the next thing to consider is really the buckle as well. It's often overlooked, but it is a critical part of support and function of your belt. When we're looking at buckles for our belts, one thing we're considering is the length of the buckle frame. So if the frame throat of the buckle itself is too short, this can cause the belt to fold over itself unnecessarily and create a bulge where the top and bottom of the belt meet each other. So we always want to ensure that the frame itself is long enough to allow the belt to lay as flat as possible. Now this aids not only in concealment, but also the longevity of the belt. It's less likely to want to crease and bend in that spot because it's laying flatter. Our buckles also have an integrated roller that's wrapped around the frame itself. Some roller buckles that are commercially available have a secondary piece that's an insert for the roller. What happens with these is you go to cinch your belt down and that roller can actually pop out and separate from the frame of the buckle. That's no good, and at that point your belt is useless. Now the buckles we use are typically 4 or 5 times more expensive than your commercially available roller buckles that most everyone else uses. For our belts, we use only the best leather and the best hardware available, including the buckles, screws, and everything that goes into making a good quality belt made here in America. So I got a couple leather samples to show you. The first one is what's going to be considered that top grain that we talked about. Now the thing about top grain is it can come in a variety of thicknesses. So this is one variant of top grain. You can see how smooth it is, how very consistent the finish of this leather is. And that's one benefit of doing the top grain is you can press this out and get a nice, smooth, consistent look. Now this leather is relatively thin. This is one that we might use on holsters or something like that. But you can also see with this leather the flex that it has. It's quite bendy, it's quite pliable, partly because it's so thin, but also because it is top grain leather and not full grain leather. This is another version of a top grain leather. It's a little bit shinier even, and even a little bit thinner. I mean, this leather almost creases when you hold it down. Top grain leather, it can be durable, but it's not best for belts. Now what we use for our belts is the full grain leather. So here's an example of that, and you can kind of see on the full grain leather itself how you can almost see the range marks and the texture of the top of the hide. It's not completely uniform, but this leather is not going to stretch, it's not going to roll, it's not going to twist, it's not going to sag on you when you're making belts out of this stuff. This leather is also very stiff. It doesn't want to fold and crease like that other leather does. I mean, I'm having to hold it pretty tight, but it's maintaining a curve to itself rather than creasing or folding. Full grain leather is by far the best leather to use for making belts, and that's all that we use at AmericanBelts.com. So I hope you learned just a little bit about the different types of leather and buckles that are out there and available. I hope you also gain some confidence in knowing that when you buy belts from us, you are getting the absolute best quality with no compromises that's available in America today. Thanks so much for watching. As always, if you have questions, please reach out to us at support@AmericanBelts.com or any of our social media channels. We'd love to talk to you. We appreciate you watching. God bless. Have a great day.